Now, I believe that Brexit cannot be complete, all the while we're subject to a foreign court and frankly, a piece of legislation brought in by the Blair government upon which judges can choose their own political interpretation.
Well, it wouldn't be a week in Westminster without Nigel Farage trying to make headlines, and this time it's over human rights. Yes, the Reform UK leader has sparked outrage and some laughter after proposing that Britain should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights.
This bill intends to return British common law and to bring back some ideas, rather than state-given rights, of birthrights, of liberty and freedom. These are things that over centuries served our country far better than any other nation in the European continent.
So if you want to know the member for Clacton's intentions for British people's basic rights and freedoms, just look at Putin's Russia or Trump's America. Madam Deputy Speaker, that isn't patriotic. It is deeply un-British, and he should be ashamed.
His bill was predictably defeated, but not before he was heckled, mocked, and accused of following in Vladimir Putin's footsteps. So, what exactly happened? Why does it matter? And what does this say about the state of British politics today? On Wednesday, Nigel Farage stood up in the House of Commons to present what's called a 10-minute rule bill, a type of private member's bill that allows MPs to pitch new laws or changes to existing ones. His proposal that the United Kingdom should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, better known as the ECHR. Now, in theory, such a move would mean the UK no longer bound itself to the human rights framework that's been in place since the 1950s, a framework we actually helped to write in the wake of World War II. But, in practice, the motion was dead on arrival. Labour benches were mostly empty. Conservative benches too. The only MPs who turned up in any numbers were from the Liberal Democrats and smaller opposition parties, and they weren't there to cheer Farage on. Farage began to deliver his speech, warning that the ECHR gives judges the power to choose their own political interpretation of the law. But as he spoke, heckles echoed across the chamber. Moments later, the proposal was voted down. 154 against, 96 in favor, a clear defeat by a majority of 58. No government whip, no real backing, and frankly, no chance of passing. But that wasn't really the point. This was, above all, another Farage performance, a chance to reignite old culture wars, and to test whether his Reform UK movement can still make waves by taking aim at international institutions. If Farage expected the Commons to quietly dismiss him, he was mistaken. Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey seized the opportunity to launch one of the most ferocious rebuttals Parliament has seen in months. Davey accused Farage of peddling dangerous nonsense, and went as far as linking his proposal to the politics of Moscow. He said, quote, "Russia under Vladimir Putin is the only country to have withdrawn from the European Convention on Human Rights. Maybe that's what attracts Mr. Farage to it. After all, he's said before that the world leader he most admires is in Russia, a country where those who oppose the regime are mysteriously pushed off balconies." The chamber gasped. Davey went on to list the many protections the ECHR provides, from freedom of speech to fair trials and the right to privacy, and warned that scrapping it would make the UK look more like an authoritarian state than a democracy. "If we do what reform wants," he said, "the biggest cheers will come from the Kremlin, from Beijing, from Tehran, and from Pyongyang. That would be a betrayal of everything our country stands for." Then, in perhaps his most personal attack, Davey accused Farage of betraying Britain through Brexit, reminding the chamber that immigration has risen, not fallen, and arguing that Brexit itself made the small boats crisis possible. As attacks go, it was blistering. And in that moment, the House of Commons felt less like a legislative chamber and more like a theater, with Farage at center stage and his critics lining up for curtain calls. To understand why this clash matters, let's step back for a second. The European Convention on Human Rights isn't part of the European Union. That's a common misconception. It's actually part of the Council of Europe, a separate organization set up in 1949 to promote democracy and protect human rights after the horrors of World War II. The UK was one of its founding members. In fact, it was largely drafted by British lawyers, inspired by Winston Churchill's belief that Europe needed shared principles of liberty and justice. The convention underpins laws we often take for granted: freedom of expression, the right to a fair trial, freedom from torture, protection of property, and the right to family life. And it's enforced by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which can rule on whether a member state has violated those principles. The UK incorporated the convention into domestic law through the Human Rights Act of 1998. That means British citizens can challenge government decisions in UK courts using those rights, rather than going all the way to Strasbourg. Farage, and some on the political right, have long claimed that this system gives foreign judges power over British sovereignty, that it ties our hands on immigration, asylum, and policing. His argument is simple, that British courts, not European ones, should decide what rights citizens have and how they're enforced. Critics, however, say withdrawing would isolate Britain, undermine international law, and strip citizens of vital protections, especially those who rely on courts to challenge government overreach. In other words, this isn't just about Europe, it's about the balance between state power and individual rights. So why is Farage pushing this now? It's unlikely he genuinely expected the bill to pass. The 10-minute rule process almost never results in real legislation, and he knew full well that neither Labour nor the Conservatives were backing him. This was about positioning. Reform UK is polling between 10 and 15% nationally, not enough to win many seats under first past the post, but enough to pressure the Conservatives on their right flank. By taking a hard line on the ECHR, Farage can present himself as the only politician willing to defend British sovereignty and take control, echoing the slogans that powered the Brexit campaign. In fact, this entire move feels like Brexit 2.0, the sequel. Same rhetoric, different target. But the political landscape has shifted. The Conservatives, exhausted and divided after years in power, have flirted with similar ideas. Home Secretary after Home Secretary has hinted that leaving the ECHR might be necessary to enforce tough asylum policies, like the Rwanda plan. By raising it now, Farage isn't just challenging Parliament, he's daring the Conservatives to follow him down that path, or risk losing their right-wing voters. In short, he's keeping himself relevant by forcing everyone else to respond. Reactions outside Westminster were as polarized as ever. Supporters of Farage praised him for having the courage to confront what they see as a bloated foreign institution. They argue that the ECHR has prevented the UK from deporting criminals, hampered border control, and interfered with British lawmaking. Opponents, however, were quick to point out that the ECHR has protected ordinary Britons from abuses by our own governments, from unlawful surveillance, to mistreatment in prisons, to discrimination cases. Human rights groups condemned Farage's bill as reckless and performative. Amnesty International called it an act of political vandalism. Legal experts described it as a dangerous stunt that could unravel decades of post-war progress. Meanwhile, social media lit up with clips from the Commons, including the heckling, laughter, and Davies' brutal one-liners. Even many Conservative voters appeared uneasy. One Tory MP was quoted anonymously saying, "It's one thing to criticize the court. It's another to align ourselves with Russia. It's a reminder that while populist rhetoric might make for good headlines, it can backfire when it starts to sound like something out of Moscow." So what would actually happen if the UK left the ECHR? Legally, it would be seismic. Every major human rights protection currently built into British law would have to be replaced or rewritten. It would also jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which explicitly references the European Convention on Human Rights as part of its foundation. Removing it could breach international obligations and destabilize the peace process. It would also complicate relationships with Europe, including post-Brexit trade and security cooperation. Several EU agreements, particularly on extradition and policing, require signatories to remain members of the ECHR. And geopolitically, Britain's withdrawal would send a powerful signal that one of Europe's oldest democracies was walking away from the very system it helped to build. That's why Ed Davies' comparison to Putin's Russia stings, not because it's entirely fair, but because it highlights how isolated Britain would be. Right now, the only country to have withdrawn from the convention is Russia, after it was expelled from the Council of Europe in 2022, following its invasion of Ukraine. So yes, if the UK followed that path, it would be in some dubious company. Farage knows all this. He's not a naive politician. He's a seasoned performer. His politics has always been about provocation, about saying the unsayable, then basking in the outrage that follows. It's how he keeps himself in the headlines, and how he keeps Reform UK on the political radar. But there's a risk. For many voters, Farage's anti-establishment tone once felt fresh, a protest against a distant Brussels bureaucracy. But when the target becomes a human rights convention that protects basic freedoms, the argument starts to sound less like freedom and more like authoritarianism. And that, perhaps, is the irony. The man who made his name railing against Europe for being undemocratic now finds himself arguing for Britain to abandon the very document that defines what democracy is. It's easy to dismiss this week's vote as just another Farage stunt, another doomed bill, another Commons sideshow. But it tells us something important about the direction of British politics. First, it shows how the political right continues to fracture, with Farage pulling the Conservatives further towards nationalism, while the moderates try to hold the center. Second, it highlights how human rights, once a point of post-war consensus, have become yet another battlefield in the culture wars. And finally, it's a reminder that populism doesn't vanish when its leaders lose elections. It adapts, it finds new targets, it changes shape. Farage's proposal may have failed in Parliament, but it succeeded in one key respect: it dominated the news cycle. And for a politician who thrives on outrage, that's victory enough. So, what do you think? Was Farage right to challenge the ECHR? Or is this another dangerous attempt to turn Britain inward? Whatever your view, one thing's clear. The debate over Britain's relationship with international law isn't going away anytime soon. And as the next general election approaches, you can expect to hear a lot more talk about sovereignty, borders, and, yes, human rights. Because in modern British politics, nothing gets heckled louder than the truth people don't want to hear.